There is a photograph in the archives of the Library of Congress that has no explanation. It was taken sometime between 1860 and 1870. The subject is a man seated in a studio, dressed in the formal clothes of his era. Nothing about him is unusual. But behind him, mounted on a wooden stand in the background, is a device, a cylindrical object with what appears to be a curved reflective dish attached to one end, connected by a thin wire coil to a flat rectangular panel resting on the table beside him. No one photographed with that kind of equipment in the 1860s. That equipment did not exist in the 1860s. The device in the background of that photograph would not be formally described, patented, or manufactured for another 6 decades. Archivists who have catalogued it list it as unidentified mechanical apparatus, and then they move on. This is not the only photograph like it. Across the major archives of Europe and North America, in collections at the Smithsonian, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and dozens of regional historical societies, there are photographs that contain objects that should not be there. Not fantastical objects, objects that look exactly like technology we recognize, technology we have been told was invented at a specific moment by a specific person, appearing in photographs taken before that moment ever happened. The standard response when these photographs surface is one of 3 things. The object is misdated, the object is misidentified, or the object is a coincidence, something that merely resembles the technology we are projecting onto it. Those explanations deserve scrutiny because they are not always wrong, but they are applied reflexively, before investigation, in a way that closes questions rather than opening them. When you look at enough of these photographs, a different picture begins to form, one that has less to do with time travel and more to do with how invention actually works, who controls the historical record of it, and what gets systematically erased when the financial interests of the people who own patents are powerful enough to rewrite the past. Start with the most documented case. In 1901, Guglielmo Marconi received the credit that would follow him to his Nobel Prize. He transmitted a wireless radio signal across the Atlantic Ocean. The history books for most of the 20th century opened the story of radio there, with Marconi, with 1901. But there is a photograph taken in 1882. It shows a laboratory space in rural Colorado. The equipment in the frame is not simple. There are coils, capacitor arrays, antenna structures that no one building that photographs accepted narrative can account for. The man who built that laboratory was Nikola Tesla, and the patents that Marconi would later use to claim his Nobel Prize were, in 1943, ruled by the United States Supreme Court to have been Tesla's patents first. The history of radio did not begin in 1901. The Supreme Court said so. But ask most people today who invented radio, and they will say Marconi, because the photographs of what existed before 1901 were not catalogued as evidence of prior technology. They were filed as curiosities, as the eccentric workspace of a man who never successfully commercialized his ideas. That last point is the key. Commercialization, not invention. The revisionist economic history of technology is not really about who had the idea first. It is about who had the capital to make the idea matter. And when you look at the photographs that contain anachronistic objects, the consistent pattern is not genius appearing ahead of its time. The consistent pattern is that the technology existed in the hands of people who lacked access to the financial machinery that converts invention into history. Consider what happened to Philo Farnsworth. There is a photograph from 1927 showing a young man in a farmhouse in Rigby, Idaho, standing next to a glass tube contraption he built from components ordered through a mail catalogue. That glass tube contraption is a functional electronic television transmission device. Farnsworth was 19 years old. He had conceived the core principle of electronic television while ploughing a potato field at 14, understanding that an electron beam could scan an image the same way the parallel furrows of turned Earth lay in front of him. In 1930, RCA sent an engineer named Vladimir Zworykin to visit Farnsworth's lab. Zworykin spent 3 days studying everything Farnsworth had built. He returned to RCA and told the company's president, David Sarnoff, that he wanted 10 months and $100,000 to replicate it. Sarnoff's response was that RCA does not pay royalties, they collect them. What followed was 11 years of patent litigation. RCA had lawyers. RCA had money. RCA had access to politicians and regulators in a way that a farm boy from Idaho with a mail-order laboratory never would. When television became a mass commercial reality in the late 1940s, it was RCA's name attached to it. Farnsworth's patents had expired, legally exhausted by the delay tactics of a corporation that understood the patent system better than any inventor ever could. Farnsworth died in 1971. He told his wife, near the end, that he felt he had failed. His invention had been used to broadcast the moon landing, a broadcast he watched in silence. His name was not mentioned once during the coverage. The photograph from 1927 still exists. It predates everything RCA ever claimed, and for decades it was simply not part of the story anyone was telling. This is the economic structure that explains most of what the anomalous photographs show. Technology does not arrive in singular moments of genius. It arrives in parallel, across multiple people in multiple places, often with decades of prior development behind the version that gets officially credited. The version that gets credited is almost always the version backed by capital, protected by aggressive patent enforcement, and supported by the kind of institutional documentation that archives preserve and cite. The versions that came before, the laboratory photographs, the workshop images, the portraits of forgotten inventors standing next to devices that would not be officially invented for another generation, those end up in boxes, mislabeled, underfunded for cataloguing, donated to archives that lack the resources to investigate what they contain. In 1839, Louis Daguerre was presented to the French Academy of Sciences as the inventor of photography. The French government purchased his process and released it to the world. What the official ceremony did not mention was Hippolyte Bayard. Bayard had developed a direct positive paper print process independently, and he demonstrated it publicly 2 months before Daguerre's official announcement. The French government, which had already committed its prestige to Daguerre, paid Bayard 600 francs and asked him quietly to delay his announcement. The invention of photography, for the purposes of the historical record, remained Daguerre's. Bayard responded by taking a self-portrait in which he posed as a drowned man. He wrote on the back that the subject had been dedicated to science and art, that his work had brought him no recognition, and that he had been driven to his end by the neglect of a government that had chosen someone else's name to put on his discovery. He titled its self-portrait as a drowned man. It is the first known political protest in the history of photography. That photograph exists. It is preserved. It is reproduced in art history books as an interesting curiosity. The economic argument it makes, that governments choose which inventions become history based on factors entirely separate from who discovered what, is rarely the part anyone teaches. Now consider a category of photographs the standard explanations struggle with more than usual. Beginning in the 1890s and continuing through the first 3 decades of the 20th century, there are photographs taken at industrial sites, in factories and shipyards and mines, that show electrical infrastructure inconsistent with the official timeline of electrification. Not wiring that could be dismissed as experimental, operational infrastructure, load-bearing electrical systems serving production facilities in regions where the official history places the first power lines 15 or 20 years later. Several of these photographs have been studied by electrical engineers who specialize in power system history. Their consistent observation is that the equipment shown is not prototype. It is installed, it is working, and the configurations shown represent technical solutions that mainstream history says were not understood until significantly later. The explanation that fits the evidence is not paranormal. It is economic and geographic. The official history of electrification was written from the records of the companies that commercialized it at scale. Edison, Westinghouse, later the regional utility monopolies. Those companies controlled their patent timelines carefully. They had investors, they had regulatory relationships, they had competitors to outmaneuver. What happened in a company town in rural Pennsylvania when an engineer figured out a cheaper way to run electrical current through a facility did not necessarily enter the patent record. It entered the operational log of a private company. And when that company went bankrupt, the operational logs went with it. What survived was the photograph someone took of the facility floor in 1898, sitting in a regional archive, filed under the name of the town, not under any searchable technological category. The history of technology has an indexing problem that is also an economic problem. The things that were commercially significant got indexed. They were defended in court. They generated paper trails. They attracted the institutional attention that causes records to be preserved and made searchable. The things that threatened something commercially significant got put in boxes. Nikola Tesla died alone in a hotel room in New York in 1943. Within hours of his death, agents from the Office of Alien Property arrived and seized every document, every notebook, every correspondence in his possession. The official justification was that he was a foreign national and the materials might contain information relevant to the war. The seizure was conducted before any family member or colleague was notified. Many of those documents were eventually returned. Many were not. A government physicist reviewed the seized materials and issued a report concluding that Tesla's late period work contained nothing of practical scientific value. What that report did not address was what had already been removed before the review began. The inventory of what was seized and the inventory of what was returned do not match. Researchers who have spent careers mapping the gap between those two lists do not agree on what was in it. They agree that the gap exists. The photographs Tesla's colleagues took of his Colorado Springs laboratory in 1899 show electrical discharges of a scale and character that the official history of electrical engineering places decades later. The photographs are real. They are authenticated. The technology shown in them remains, by the official account, ahead of what was possible when they were taken. The official account was written after the documents were seized. Come back to the original photograph, the one in the Library of Congress. The man in his formal clothes, and behind him the cylindrical device with the curved dish, the wire coil, the flat panel on the table. No one has identified it conclusively. The man has been identified. A minor industrialist in the mid-Atlantic region. No known connection to any laboratory or research institution. No record related to technology or invention. But someone put that device in his photograph. Someone built it. Someone understood what it was for. The question it asks is not whether someone in 1865 invented a technology we associate with 1925. The question is simpler and more unsettling. How many times has this happened? How many photographs are in those boxes with the incorrect labels and the underfunded cataloguing and the archivists who note the anomaly and move on? How much of what we call the history of invention is actually the history of which inventions were capitalized, patented, litigated, and written into the record by the people with enough resources to make their version permanent? Photography is indifferent to what it records. It does not know which version of history is supposed to be true. It captures what was in front of it, whether or not the institutions that came after had any interest in explaining what that was. The photographs are still in the archives. The objects in them are still unidentified. The institutional machinery that decides which questions are worth asking is the same machinery that decided in 1899 and 1927 and 1943 which version of invention became history. The device is in the photograph. Nobody is asking what it did.